What if I told you that unraveling the mysteries of the past could change the way you see the present? Today, we're stepping into a world where ancient promises meet modern dilemmas, and the lines between faith, history, and identity blur. Stay with us because by the end of this journey, you'll discover a perspective that could transform how you view the world and yourself. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that makes you think deeply. And while you're here, drop a comment about what you think. Is history bound to repeat itself? Or do we shape it anew? Now, let's dive in. A soft hum of electronic static filled the darkened room, punctuated by subtle flickers of neon blue light. Miriam, a doctoral student in comparative theology, sat alone in front of an immense holographic display. She could feel the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders. She was here to do what few had dared, to unravel the tapestry of biblical Israel and modern Israel, to question assumptions, and to seek truth through an advanced AI-driven simulation. The program, known only as the Oracle, had been fed every known historical record, every scriptural text, every political document. Now it whispered possibilities. Miriam lifted her gaze as the simulation initialized. Before her eyes, shifting images of deserts, mountains, and ancient stone towns blended seamlessly with the stark modern lines of contemporary Tel Aviv. The Oracle's voice, resonant and soothing, began. To understand the Israel of today, we must return to the patriarch who first received the promise of land and covenant. We must re-experience Abraham's calling. With trembling fingers, Miriam keyed a command. Suddenly, she was virtually transported into an endless expanse of golden sand. She saw distant camels, tents, and figures dressed in primitive garments. She could smell the dry air, feel the warmth of the sun. This was no mere historical reenactment. The Oracle's data streams granted her a sensory journey beyond standard historical analysis. In the far distance, a figure emerged, staff in hand. The Oracle's voice whispered, "This is the origin, Abraham, the bearer of the first covenant." Miriam's heart pounded. She understood that this expedition would challenge her faith, her scholarship, and her perspective. Was modern Israel truly the continuation of this ancient promise? Or had something shifted? The desert wind blew, and the journey began. Miriam stepped forward, astonished to find that the holographic environment offered tangible sensations. Her boots pressed into warm sand that crunched softly beneath her feet. The Oracle's voice guided her. "Observe carefully. This land, though ancient, is not mere territory. It's a stage upon which a divine covenant unfolds." She approached the figure of Abraham, who stood by a simple tent, eyes cast upward. Miriam felt a surge of awe. Here was a man chosen not for his might, but for his obedience and faith. In Genesis, he received a promise, a land for his descendants, a nation through which all the world would be blessed. The land, Canaan, was vast and not confined by today's borders. Abraham stirred as if sensing Miriam's presence, though she was only a traveler in time. The Oracle's voice explained, in the biblical narrative, land and covenant are intertwined. Yet the promise came with conditions: faithfulness, obedience, and moral responsibility. The chosen people were to reflect divine values, not merely claim territory. As she listened, Miriam's mind drifted to modern Israel, its strategic borders, political struggles, and secular governance. How could this complex modern state be aligned with the spiritual dimensions Abraham's descendants were to embody? Was the covenant a birthright or a calling that demanded inner transformation? She looked again at Abraham. No armies, no high-tech defenses, no UN resolutions, just a man and his God, forging a bond for future generations. This first step in her journey revealed a profound truth. Biblical Israel was less about land than the people's relationship with the divine. As the desert wind shifted, the scene began to blur, giving way to another image. Miriam prepared herself to move forward in time, guided by divine words. Stepping deeper into the story, the desert scene dissolved into darkness, then re-emerged into a new landscape. Now Miriam stood at the edge of a fortified city. Stone walls rose before her, and beyond them, She glimpsed fertile fields and a wide horizon. The oracle's voice echoed, "We now enter a later era, a time when the descendants of Abraham have settled the land. This is the period of the judges and early kings, a time of moral struggle, identity formation, and the crystallization of covenantal ideals." Miriam watched as people moved busily through stone streets, carrying baskets of grain, tending livestock, and engaging in trade. She saw the elders discussing matters at the city gate. Inside a modest home, a family recited prayers, passing stories from generation to generation. Their identities were rooted in a shared calling. They were Israel, a people called to reflect divine character through justice, mercy, and righteousness. Yet she also sensed tension. Some sought to worship other gods or adopt the customs of neighboring cultures. Wars and alliances, betrayals and reformations would shape their history. Miriam recalled the biblical account. The land was never a guarantee of righteousness. It was a testing ground. The people's fidelity, or lack thereof, determined their fate. As she pondered these truths, Miriam thought of modern Israel again, a nation reclaiming ancestral lands after millennia of exile. Yes, but what about the original spiritual mandate? Today's Israel, with its secular governance and political concerns, seemed distant from the pure vision of a covenant people. The oracle's voice whispered, "Here you see the seeds of a nation's identity. But identity is not static. It grows, evolves, and sometimes fractures." With that, the walls and fields blurred, and Miriam prepared for another leap forward. The journey was only beginning. The scene shimmered again, revealing Jerusalem in its early glory. Miriam now stood before imposing stone architecture, King David's city in its formative years. She observed the hustle of artisans, the chanting of priests, and the regal air that surrounded the place. The oracle spoke. David unified the tribes and established Jerusalem as a spiritual and political capital. Under his reign, and later Solomon's, Israel reached a zenith, yet even at its heights, divine expectations remained central. Miriam watched as priests entered a sacred tent where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, symbolizing the divine presence among the people. The city teemed with cultural richness, music from stringed instruments, poetry echoing in communal gatherings, craftsmanship adorning palace walls. The people held a collective memory of having been slaves in Egypt, now shaped into a nation with laws that demanded compassion for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. Yet Miriam knew that power and prestige often led to corruption. The promise of land and blessing could be misunderstood as entitlements rather than responsibilities. The prophets would soon rise, calling people back to covenant fidelity. Miriam reflected again on modern Israel, so often defined by geopolitical struggles. Where was that prophetic voice today, insisting on spiritual depth over political might? The oracle interjected, "The ancient Israel you see here is far from perfect, but its identity is anchored in a divine calling. The land is an inheritance, but also a burden of righteousness." As Miriam lingered, she wondered how centuries of exile and diaspora had transformed Jewish identity. The ancient theocratic vision seemed distant from the modern secular state. Could the modern nation still be connected to this divine narrative? Or had it become something else entirely? The oracle's images began to morph again, carrying Miriam to another epoch. The world dissolved, and Miriam found herself amid the cries of prophets. She saw Isaiah in the dusty streets of Jerusalem, his voice ringing out against injustice. She saw Jeremiah, lamenting the spiritual decline of the people, warning that exile loomed if they failed to uphold their covenant. The oracle's tone turned grave. A critical shift approaches. Israel's relationship with its God and land is tested. The Babylonian armies will come, and with them, an existential crisis. Miriam stepped carefully through narrow alleys as people argued over the prophet's words. Some dismissed them, clinging to a belief that the land itself guaranteed God's favor. Others wept, fearing the loss of everything they held dear. Miriam knew how the story ended. The temple would be destroyed. The elite carried off to Babylon. Exile would redefine what it meant to be Israel without the sacred land. In this turbulence, Miriam gleaned an essential lesson. The covenant was never about possessing land unconditionally. The prophets insisted that justice, mercy, and devotion were non-negotiable. Without them, the privilege of dwelling in the land could be revoked. The land was not a magical charm, but a place of stewardship. The oracle spoke softly. Remember this moment when you consider the modern state. Israel's identity after exile would become less about territory and more about the law, the relationship with God, the survival of a people chosen to witness to divine truth. Miriam imagined the long centuries of diaspora ahead, where Jewish communities would endure foreign lands, maintain traditions, and shape their identity around faith and hope rather than political sovereignty. Compared to that, the modern state's existence posed complex questions. Did the reestablishment of Israel in 1948 align with the covenant's spiritual demands? Or had politics overshadowed faith? Time leapt forward. Miriam found herself in Babylon. She observed synagogues forming quietly along riverbanks, scribes meticulously copying Torah scrolls, and families gathering to sing psalms in exile. The oracle explained, in diaspora, separated from the land, Israel's identity crystallized around Torah, ethical living, and the hope of return. This hope, however, did not hinge solely on political conquest. It was about spiritual restoration. Miriam saw resilience forged in hardship. The people learned that being Israel wasn't about controlling territory, but about carrying the covenant within their hearts. Their songs of longing for Jerusalem were not just for stone walls, but for the divine presence and the moral order the land once symbolized. Here, in Babylon, the connection to modern Israel began to form. Miriam recognized that millennia later, driven by Zionism, originally a political movement responding to persecution, Jews would return to their ancestral lands. But what was lost in translation? The oracle's voice. The early Zionists sought a safe haven, a political solution, not necessarily a revival of the covenant as defined by Scripture. Miriam pondered how centuries of waiting might alter a people's perspective. When the State of Israel emerged in 1948, it was hailed as a miracle by many, yet it was also a modern nation-state, influenced by secular ideologies and political strategies. The prophets once warned that mere occupation of the land without obedience would ring hollow. How did that warning echo through the corridors of modern government offices? Fighter jets roaring overhead, and negotiations at international tables? As Miriam observed the scribes in Babylon, she realized that Israel's identity had always been dynamic. Now, faced with modern Israel's complexities, understanding this evolution was key. With a subtle shift, the scene faded, preparing to reveal another era in the long saga. The environment shifted once more. Miriam now stood in a reconstructed Jerusalem after the exile. During the era of Ezra and Nehemiah, the people had returned, but the city was a pale shadow of its former self. Walls were rebuilt, temples restored, but something had changed in the communal psyche. They understood vulnerability. They knew the land wasn't guaranteed. Miriam observed a scene at the rebuilt temple, priests performing rituals, the community rejoicing, weeping, and reading the law aloud. The oracle's voice was thoughtful. Post-exilic Israel learned that fidelity to God's commandments, not military might or political maneuvering, secured their connection to the land. Though physically smaller and less influential, they rediscovered their purpose as a people bound to divine ethics. In time, these lessons would encounter the pressures of empires, Persian, Greek, Roman, each imposing its order. Miriam foresaw how Roman oppression and internal strife would lead to revolts and, ultimately, a second exile after the temple's destruction in 70 CE. Each turn of the historical wheel underscored the truth. Land alone was not Israel's strength. Covenant fidelity was. She recalled that modern Israel emerged after centuries of displacement, fueled by European anti-Semitism and the Holocaust horror. The desire for a Jewish homeland was understandable, even urgent, to prevent another catastrophe. But as Miriam considered the spiritual dimension, she wondered, could a modern political state inherit the covenantal mantle if it did not prioritize divine laws and prophetic justice? The oracle reminded her, this is the crux of your inquiry. Biblical Israel was never solely a political entity. It was a people defined by covenant, often chastised by prophets for failing to uphold divine standards. Modern Israel, though bearing the ancient name, must contend with these deeper spiritual responsibilities or acknowledge a different identity. The simulation advanced centuries ahead. Miriam found herself in a Roman-ruled Judea, the air thick with tension. She moved through bustling marketplaces where Jewish merchants sold spices, oil, and cloth under the watchful eyes of Roman soldiers. In the distance, she spotted the grand temple refurbished by Herod. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity lay unrest and simmering resentment. The oracle's voice was somber. During the time of Jesus, Israel was under foreign rule. Many yearned for liberation. Some believed the Messiah would appear as a warrior king to restore sovereignty. Instead, they encountered one who spoke of repentance, inward transformation, and a kingdom not of this world. Miriam observed Jesus teaching on a hillside, surrounded by curious crowds. His message emphasized love, mercy, and the law's true spirit. He challenged the religious leaders who clung to power structures. She recalled that Israel's original calling was to be a light to the nations. Yet here, they grappled with oppression and internal divisions. The covenant's essence seemed obscured. In time, Jesus would be rejected and crucified, an event intertwined with both Jewish and Roman authorities. Miriam considered the modern implications. Many Christians today regard modern Israel as a spiritual heir to ancient promises, but forget the New Testament's complexities. The land was never a shortcut to divine favor, and Jesus himself warned against placing hope solely in earthly constructs. The oracle explained, the narrative diverges here. Early Christians, many of them Jewish, spread a message that God's people now include all who follow the Messiah, transcending territorial boundaries. Meanwhile, Jewish identity continued to evolve, scattered and shaped by faith and memory. As the scene faded, Miriam grappled with the question, how does modern Israel fit into these developments? Perhaps the next chapters of history would reveal more. Now Miriam witnessed a heartbreaking event, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. She stood amidst chaos as Roman legions set fire to the sanctuary. The cries of families, the clashing of swords, and the wailing lamentations filled the air. The oracle spoke quietly. This moment severs the physical anchor of religious life. Without the temple, Judaism transforms once more, focusing on study, prayer, and the interpretation of Torah. A nation is scattered again. As Jerusalem burned, Miriam sensed the profound shift. Israel's identity would now survive not through land or temple, but through a living tradition carried in memory and practice. Rabbinic Judaism emerged, nurturing a covenantal life in foreign lands. Synagogues and study halls. For nearly 2 millennia, Jews lived as minorities, maintaining their faith against immense odds. Miriam reflected on modern Israel's emergence in 1948. Long after this catastrophe, Zionism was a response to persistent oppression and pogroms, culminating in the Holocaust. The Jewish people yearned for a safe homeland. Yet the original covenantal vision demanded moral righteousness. Would the modern state reawaken that ethos? Or would it become another secular power struggling for survival in a harsh world? The oracle commented, biblical Israel's essence traveled through centuries of diaspora, evolving and adapting. Modern Israel claims historical continuity, yet spiritual alignment is not automatic. The land is a stage, but the script requires fidelity to divine principles. Without them, what remains? Miriam knew many Christians uncritically supported modern Israel, believing it fulfilled prophecy. But prophecy in Scripture often warned that occupation without obedience was hollow. With Jerusalem's downfall etched in her mind, she resolved to delve deeper. She needed to see modern Israel's birth, its founders' visions, and its struggles. Perhaps then the truth would emerge. A massive chronological leap occurred. Miriam now stood in a European train station in the late 19th century. Newspapers proclaimed growing anti-Semitism. Pogroms drove Jewish communities from Eastern Europe. The Dreyfus Affair in France. The rising tide of exclusion. These pressures shaped the dreams of a homeland. The oracle's voice explained, Zionism was born from crisis. Theodor Herzl and others believed that only a Jewish state could guarantee safety. Religion played a role, but political necessity was paramount. Miriam watched as Herzl delivered impassioned speeches. He envisioned a modern state, secular in nature, where Jews could find refuge. Gone were the days of biblical theocracy. This was about political sovereignty, cultural revival, and national identity. The ancient covenant and prophetic imperatives were not the primary driving force. In cafes and meeting halls, heated debates erupted. Some religious Jews opposed Zionism, fearing it would supplant spiritual devotion with nationalism. Others embraced it, seeing it as a step toward messianic redemption. Still others, firmly secular, cared little for prophecy but much for human rights and survival. Miriam realized that the connection between biblical Israel and modern Israel was far from straightforward. The modern state emerged as a safe haven and cultural renaissance, not explicitly as a spiritual revival. Yet the land chosen was the ancient homeland, laden with covenantal history. Could the old promises still resonate amid new motivations? The oracle interjected, "This is the paradox. Modern Israel inherits biblical geography, but not necessarily biblical governance. Its leaders, often secular, prioritize security and identity. Faith and covenant became personal or communal choices, not state policy." As Miriam considered this, she prepared to witness the tumultuous 20th century, the Holocaust, the UN partition plan, and Israel's birth. Only then could she judge how these forces shaped the new Israel. The scene dissolved and reformed into a haunting tableau. Europe in the 1940s. Miriam observed Jewish families being rounded up, trains departing to concentration camps. The Holocaust, a trauma so profound it nearly defied comprehension, seared itself into the Jewish psyche. 6 million Jews murdered. The oracle's voice spoke with reverence. This atrocity accelerated the push for a Jewish homeland. Necessity became undeniable. Miriam shuddered at the images. After such horror, how could one blame Jews for embracing any chance at safety? Zionism's secular or spiritual nature mattered less when survival was at stake. The longing for a homeland now carried urgency and grief. In 1947, the UN discussed partitioning British Mandatory Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Miriam watched diplomats argue, maps unfurling, lines drawn and redrawn. Then, on May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Streets filled with celebration as Jewish refugees poured in from Europe and Arab lands. Yet from the beginning, conflict arose. The oracle explained, this Israel was forged in modern political frameworks, recognized by international institutions. Some saw prophecy fulfilled. Others saw a colonial project displacing Palestinians. The land was the same soil of ancient Canaan, but the spiritual dynamic was complex. Miriam knew how Christians often interpreted these events. Many embraced Israel's rebirth as a sign of end-times prophecy. Yet, as she knew from the scriptures, the true Israel wasn't merely about geography or ethnicity, it was about covenant faithfulness. Modern Israel's founders often emphasized security, identity, and nationhood over strict religious adherence. Still, could God's plan operate even through secular means? Could the reestablishment serve as a stage for future spiritual awakening? Miriam did not know. She would have to explore modern Israel's internal complexities, its politics, religion, culture, and moral dilemmas. Miriam stepped into a new simulation layer. Arriving in 1950s Tel Aviv, modern buildings rose from sandy soil, cranes and scaffolding defining a rapidly changing skyline. Immigrants from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East mingled in cafes, forging a new Israeli identity out of countless diasporic fragments. Hebrew, once primarily a liturgical language, was reborn as a living tongue. The oracle's voice resonated. This young state, though Jewish, was not governed by biblical law. It maintained a secular democracy. Religious parties influenced policy to a degree, but Israel's ethos was shaped by pragmatic concerns: defense, economy, infrastructure. Miriam wandered through bustling streets. She heard debates about land development, water resources, and integrating new immigrants. She watched as politicians argued in the Knesset, forging alliances, drafting laws. This Israel, although culturally Jewish, did not mirror the theocratic vision of ancient times. Instead, it reflected a modern social fabric, stitched together from diverse Jewish experiences and a secular framework. Yet, beyond the boundaries of these growing cities, Palestinians who had lived on this land for generations faced displacement and marginalization. Their villages, memories, and claims complicated the narrative of a miraculous return. Miriam understood that supporting modern Israel blindly, as some Christians did, ignored the complexity of justice. Could a covenant people neglect the rights of others? The oracle's voice grew nuanced. Modern Israel's legitimacy and morality are debated. The biblical promise included moral imperatives. The prophets warned about oppressing strangers. Modern Israel must grapple with these commands, or risk hollowing its spiritual inheritance. Miriam felt the tension. The promise to Abraham encompassed blessing all nations. How could that ideal inform a state struggling with security and identity? She needed to press further into Israel's religious factions, its secular majority, and the global Christian fascination that sustained it. The era advanced again. It was now the 1960s and 70s. Miriam witnessed the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973, moments that would reshape Israel's borders and psyche. Within 6 days, Israel seized control of the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula. Suddenly, biblical lands, including Jerusalem's Old City, were under Israeli authority. Many religious Jews saw this as a divine sign, reclaiming sacred territories. The oracle's voice grew solemn. Modern Israel now held territories that overlapped with ancient biblical domains. Some believed prophecy was unfolding. Others saw a political quagmire, occupations that would fuel ongoing conflict. Miriam watched soldiers praying at the Western Wall, tears of joy streaming down their faces. She also saw Palestinian families displaced, communities torn apart, and a bitter conflict taking root. The mixture of religious awe and human suffering created a moral paradox. While some Christians abroad rejoiced at these events, proclaiming them fulfillments of prophecy, Miriam could not ignore the ethical questions. If biblical Israel was about righteousness, how did occupation and displacement fit? Where was the line between historical reclamation and injustice? The oracle reminded her. The prophets demanded that Israel treat the foreigner and the vulnerable with justice. A true covenant people cannot disregard these commands. Modern Israel's political and military expansions must be weighed against the spiritual mandates at the covenant's core. Miriam realized that Christian support for Israel often simplified these issues, framing them as good versus evil. Reality was more intricate. Understanding required navigating theology, morality, and historical complexity. She prepared to move forward again, perhaps by examining today's Israel, its religious diversity, secular majority, and international relations. She might find a nuanced truth. Miriam was now immersed in the late 20th century. She saw the rise of religious Zionists who argued that settling the biblical heartland was a divine imperative. At the same time, secular Israelis preferred peace negotiations, land for peace deals, and normalizing relations. The contradictions within Israeli society were profound. Some citizens were deeply religious, others largely secular, and still others spiritual but non-orthodox. The oracle explained. This diversity complicates the notion that modern Israel is a straightforward fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The population is not uniformly devout, nor does the state adhere strictly to Torah law. Instead, it's a mosaic of beliefs, shaped by history, trauma, and cultural revival. Miriam visited a Tel Aviv cafe, overhearing intellectuals debate ethics and identity. She passed through a Jerusalem yeshiva where students pored over Talmudic texts. She ventured into West Bank settlements, where some settlers believed they were instruments of God's plan, and into Palestinian villages, where bitterness and longing for self-determination intensified. She also noted global Christian tourism in the Holy Land. Pilgrims sought the footsteps of Jesus, eager to strengthen their faith by touching ancient stones. Meanwhile, evangelical movements in America funneled support to Israel, sometimes ignoring the plight of Palestinians because they believed that supporting Israel meant blessing Abraham's descendants. Miriam understood why the oracle wanted her to see this complexity. Biblical Israel was about a covenant people under divine guidance. Modern Israel is a modern state, compelling, heroic, flawed, and struggling with immense moral dilemmas. The name might be the same, and the land might overlap, but the essence had changed, or at least was contested. To fully judge, she would need to see how Christians navigated this landscape. Were they championing true covenant values or conflating geopolitics with divine mandate? Pause for a moment. If you were in Miriam's shoes, virtually walking through history, what question would you ask Abraham about the promises he received? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's start a discussion on how the past speaks to our future. The oracle transported Miriam into the digital age of the 21st century. She saw Israelis glued to smartphones, reading news updates about regional conflicts. She witnessed intense political debates over settlements, peace deals, and economic policies. In Jerusalem's Old City, tourists, pilgrims, Jews, Muslims, and Christians shared crowded alleys, each with their own sacred stories layered upon these stones. The oracle's tone was measured. In this century, Israel is a regional power, technologically advanced, militarily strong, and culturally vibrant. Yet the question of spiritual identity persists. Is it the Israel of the Bible or something else entirely? Miriam visited a modern Israeli synagogue, small and intimate, where devout Jews prayed fervently. She then toured secular kibbutzim, where communal life once thrived on socialist ideals. She explored ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods that seemed like time capsules of Eastern European shtetls. The contrasts were staggering. There was not one Israel, but many, coexisting uncomfortably. In Christian circles abroad, she observed a divide. Some insisted that modern Israel's very existence was divine intervention, fulfilling prophecies of a return to the land. Others argued that without a genuine return to covenant faithfulness, this political state could not be equated with biblical Israel. To them, Israel's modern form was a sign of the times, but not the final fulfillment of all God's promises. The oracle reminded Miriam, Scripture warns against blind allegiance. The prophets called for justice and righteousness. Jesus warned against conflating God's kingdom with worldly power. Christians must discern carefully. Supporting modern Israel can't mean endorsing injustice. True blessing involves guiding all parties toward peace, fairness, and ethical living. With this in mind, Miriam knew the journey was reaching critical questions. She would soon face the ultimate challenge: how to reconcile theology, morality, and geopolitics. Now Miriam stood in a quiet study chamber. The oracle's holographic form materialized as a serene figure made of golden light. You have seen the layers of history, it said. Now, consider the spiritual question. The biblical promise to Abraham was not a blank check. It was a covenant requiring obedience. Without moral integrity, the promise rings hollow. Modern Israel stands as a testament to perseverance, a refuge for a persecuted people. But does it meet the covenant's terms? Miriam breathed deeply. She recalled the prophets condemning idolatry, injustice, exploitation of the poor, and hard-heartedness. Ancient Israel suffered exile for failing to uphold divine standards. The chosen people were always called to reflect God's character, not merely occupy land. Modern Israel, while remarkable in its achievements, could not easily claim to be a theocratic state living by Torah law. Political pragmatism, security imperatives, and nationalistic fervor often overshadowed spiritual mandates. Yet, within its borders, spiritual sparks existed, faithful communities striving for righteousness, secular Israelis longing for ethical governance, and religious voices calling for compassion. Miriam considered Christian perspectives. Some equated supporting modern Israel with honoring God's covenant, but Scripture demanded discernment. God's blessing followed obedience, not partial political alignment. Could Christians pray for Israel's safety, acknowledge its right to exist, and simultaneously challenge it to moral responsibility? Yes, they could. Indeed, they must. Authentic support should guide Israel and its neighbors toward peace and justice, not an uncritical endorsement of all actions. The oracle reminded Miriam. The question was, is modern Israel the same as biblical Israel? The answer is complex. They share geography and heritage, but differ in spiritual orientation. Modern Israel may be part of a larger divine narrative, but one that still unfolds, calling for righteous engagement from all who observe. The oracle directed Miriam's attention to how Christian theology evolved after Jesus. The apostles, all Jewish, interpreted Israel's promises through the lens of the Messiah. In Romans, Paul spoke of a spiritual Israel, a people of faith, both Jew and Gentile. The land promises were not nullified, but were expanded in meaning, focusing on God's kingdom encompassing all believers. Miriam pondered how modern Christians often compartmentalize these truths. Some unconditionally supported modern Israel, believing it was a pivotal piece of eschatological prophecy. Others took a more cautious approach, emphasizing the universal body of Christ. The oracle asked, do Christians bless Abraham's descendants by upholding justice and truth, or by endorsing any policy they enact? She realized that the biblical mandate, I will bless those who bless you, didn't mean empowering moral failings. True blessing would involve guiding Israel toward its highest calling, encouraging righteousness, compassion, and peace with neighbors. In the complexity of the Middle East conflict, Israelis and Palestinians both suffering, the Christian role might be peacemaking. The oracle whispered, recall Jesus' Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers. Shouldn't Christians strive to foster conditions for peace rather than uncritically champion one side? True love seeks the good of all involved. Miriam understood that political Israel today is a nation-state, subject to human frailty. Biblical Israel was a covenant community accountable to divine standards. The two overlap historically and ethnically, but not seamlessly spiritually. Christians must discern these layers. With this clarity, Miriam felt a weight lift. She could appreciate Israel's historical significance, support its right to exist, remember the horrors that birthed it, and still urge it toward moral accountability. Such balanced engagement honored the biblical principles at the heart of the original covenant. Miriam now scrutinized how media and political interests influence perceptions of Israel. The oracle presented streams of headlines, news clips, and social media feeds. Western media often highlighted Israel's security concerns and democratic values. Others criticized its occupation policies and human rights issues. Hollywood's cultural influence sometimes cast Israel as heroic underdogs. Simultaneously, conspiracy theories spread, accusing Zionist control of global affairs. The oracle cautioned, complexities abound. The Jewish diaspora, having contributed richly to arts, sciences, and economics, naturally appears influential. But conflating influence with sinister control is both inaccurate and anti-Semitic. Miriam recognized the necessity of nuance. The presence of Jewish people in influential sectors does not equal a monolithic plot. Zionism, at its core, was about securing a homeland, not orchestrating world domination. Christians, tasked with truth and love, must reject conspiracy thinking and avoid feeding anti-Semitic tropes. Yet acknowledging these facts did not absolve Israel's policies from scrutiny. Christians committed to justice must challenge actions that harm Palestinians or perpetuate unrest. True discernment meant neither demonizing nor idolizing the modern state. Miriam also learned that American politics often intertwined with support for Israel. Evangelical Christians, seeing Israel as central to prophecy, lobbied politicians to maintain strong ties. In response, politicians courted this influence. Meanwhile, Palestinians and their supporters felt marginalized, their narratives overshadowed. The oracle reminded Miriam, part of truly blessing Israel involves honest dialogue, seeking peace, understanding contexts, and encouraging moral reflection. Christians must resist political oversimplifications, recognizing that the biblical vision calls for peace. justice, and reconciliation. Miriam appreciated how this complexity reflected the biblical tradition. Life is messy, truth nuanced. She took a deep breath. The journey was not simple, but it was enlightening. The oracle guided Miriam to observe Western Christian gatherings. In a large American megachurch, a pastor delivered a sermon praising Israel, equating its policies with God's will. Flags and maps adorned the stage, and congregants prayed fervently for the state's prosperity. Yet they rarely mentioned the Palestinian Christians who lived under Israeli rule or the moral complexities of occupation. Miriam listened with a heavy heart. She understood devotion, but saw how it could slip into partisanship. The pastor cited Genesis 12 verse 3, insisting unconditional support guaranteed blessings. But Miriam remembered the prophet's emphasis on justice. True love corrects, encourages righteousness, and seeks shalom for all. The oracle's voice was gentle. Christians, guided by Scripture, must distinguish between ancient covenant promises and modern political realities. God never commanded blind endorsement of any nation's actions. Instead, He demanded moral accountability from His chosen people. Miriam pictured an alternative scenario, a Christian community that prayed for Israel's spiritual renewal, for Palestinian dignity, for peacemakers who dared to bridge divides. She envisioned Christians who understood that the covenant was not a simple contract granting impunity, but a guiding light toward holiness. As she contemplated these possibilities, Miriam realized her journey had transformed her perspective. She no longer saw modern Israel as a direct continuation of biblical Israel in all respects. Instead, she saw overlapping histories and shared ancestry, but also a divergence in spiritual focus. Israel today is part of a complex global narrative, needing both support and honest accountability. She wondered how this understanding might influence her future work, her teaching, and her contributions to theological discourse. The oracle gave her space to reflect, preparing her for the concluding chapters of this long odyssey. The oracle led Miriam back into the desert landscape where her journey began. The shifting sands, shimmering heat, and distant tints reminded her of Abraham's quiet faith. Here, at the origin of the covenant, the simplicity of the relationship between God and man came into focus. Consider Abraham, the oracle said. He had no army, no political entity, just a promise and a call to faithfulness. The descendants of Abraham would inherit the land, but on conditions that they be a blessing to all nations. Miriam knelt down, letting sand run through her fingers. She thought about how modern Israel lived under constant tension, threatened by neighbors, pressured by global politics, and torn internally. Surely any community in such a predicament would struggle to live fully by lofty ideals. Yet the biblical narrative insisted that divine favor was tied to moral conduct. Could it be that the modern state is a preparatory stage, a stepping stone, or a chance for renewal? The land is there. The people have returned, and the world watches. Perhaps in time, a spiritual awakening could occur, or perhaps the modern state will remain a secular refuge, valuable but not the full embodiment of biblical prophecy. The oracle advised, your task is not to judge final outcomes, but to understand. God's narrative unfolds in unexpected ways. Christians should pray for wisdom, seek truth, and support efforts at reconciliation, peace, and justice, values at the covenant's core. Miriam rose, feeling a new clarity. She accepted that the modern state of Israel is not identical to biblical Israel, yet it is linked to that ancient story, carrying both its burdens and its hopes. The next steps, how Christians engage, how Israelis evolve spiritually, and how global politics adapt, remain an open chapter. Miriam turned her attention to the question of prophecy. In various Christian eschatological frameworks, the regathering of Jews to Israel is seen as a precursor to end-times events. She recalled interpretations of Ezekiel's vision, the valley of dry bones, and the talk of Gog and Magog. Could the modern conflicts be steps toward a final resolution? The oracle spoke carefully. Prophecy is complex. The biblical texts often mix historical events with future hopes. Many prophecies had immediate fulfillments, later reinterpretations, and potential future implications. Discerning which apply to modern Israel requires humility. Miriam pondered the ongoing conflicts, wars, intifadas, peace treaties, and broken accords. The Middle East is a cauldron of narratives, Jewish, Arab, Christian, Islamic, each with its eschatology, each claiming truth. If prophecy calls for Israel's presence in the land at the end of days, it doesn't automatically sanctify all its actions. Instead, it sets a stage requiring moral choices. She considered Jesus' words, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but the end is still to come." True believers should remain watchful, not alarmed, focusing on faithfulness rather than speculation. If the modern state plays a role in God's ultimate plan, it does not remove the obligation to act justly. The Oracle concluded, Christians fixated on timelines may forget their daily calling to reflect Christ's character. Whether or not modern Israel fulfills certain prophecies, the Christian mandate is to love God, love neighbor, and seek peace. If Israel is part of God's plan, it will become evident in due time. Meanwhile, the moral imperatives remain unchanging. Miriam nodded. Prophecy was not a license for moral complacency. It was an invitation to remain faithful and discerning. Miriam reflected on how Palestinian voices fit into this narrative. The oracle showed her villages scarred by conflict, families divided by checkpoints, and a young generation unsure of their future. Many Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, see modern Israel as oppressor rather than redeemer. The biblical call to protect the stranger and love neighbors resonates here with urgent force. The oracle said softly, if Israel is to reflect biblical values, it must reconcile with the reality of another people living on the same land. The pursuit of justice cannot be ignored. Christians who support Israel for theological reasons must also advocate for fairness towards Palestinians. Miriam watched as Palestinian Christians struggled to maintain their faith traditions under duress. They prayed in churches older than some European cathedrals, guardians of a Middle Eastern Christianity that predated Islam and European missions. Their plight complicated simplistic narratives, reminding Miriam that the Holy Land hosted diverse heirs to biblical faith. The crux was this: biblical Israel was chosen to bless all nations, not just itself. Modern Israel, if it aspires to that heritage, should strive for policies that elevate dignity, peace, and mutual respect. Christians, tasked with blessing Abraham's descendants, must encourage such righteousness. Miriam now saw that to bless Israel meant to help it align with covenantal ethics, to stand against injustices, and to support paths to reconciliation. The complexity of Middle Eastern politics doesn't annul these principles. It makes them harder to apply, but more necessary than ever. Realizing that abstract theology had real-world implications, Miriam's heart grew heavy, yet she also felt hope. Truth, once acknowledged, could inspire efforts toward a more just future. The oracle now showed Miriam global diplomacy, peace talks in Madrid, Oslo Accords, Camp David summits, all attempts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Each endeavor promised hope, but ultimately fell short. Yet, international engagement demonstrated that the world cared. The Holy Land's spiritual significance ensured global attention. Miriam observed diplomats shaking hands, signing treaties, and giving hopeful speeches. Yet trust remained elusive. Extremists on all sides sabotaged dialogue. Meanwhile, ordinary people longed for safety, prosperity, and the chance to raise children without fear. The oracle noted, some Christians see these peace efforts as distractions from prophecy, believing divine intervention alone will bring lasting peace. Others see peacemaking as a biblical mandate. Blessed are the peacemakers. Striving for peace honors God's values, no matter when the eschaton arrives. Miriam acknowledged that prophecy need not exclude human responsibility. God often worked through human agents, urging them toward righteousness. Could not peace-building be a form of obedience, a way to reflect God's character? The complexity of the region demanded wisdom. Modern Israel, far from the theocratic ideal, could still move closer to biblical ethics if it embraced compassion. Similarly, Palestinians, with their own claims and suffering, could also move toward forgiveness and mutual understanding. This was no simple task. She envisioned a role for Christians worldwide. Instead of fueling polarization, they could support diplomatic efforts, humanitarian aid, and interfaith dialogue. This would be a more honest form of blessing, one aligned with covenantal themes of justice and mercy. The oracle spoke gently, as you have learned. Understanding the difference between biblical Israel and modern Israel frees you to engage responsibly, refusing to collapse profound spiritual truths into shallow political loyalties. Miriam now considered the role of Zionism in Western media. The oracle displayed film studios, newsrooms, and financial hubs. Jewish people, due to historical circumstances and cultural emphasis on education, had risen in many fields. Their visibility sometimes sparked envy or suspicion, fueling anti-Semitic myths. The oracle clarified, influence and success do not imply sinister control. Many factors shape media narratives: market forces, cultural interests, editorial biases. Zionism is a political movement, not a secret cabal. Miriam realized that embracing conspiracy theories distracted from real ethical issues. Instead of demonizing a people, one must engage legitimate concerns. Why does the Israeli government pursue certain policies? How does the media represent Palestinian perspectives? These questions seek accountability, not scapegoating. Christians, holding truth as sacred, should reject falsehoods. Championing honesty would protect both Jewish communities from harmful stereotypes and Palestinians from neglect. Engaging critically with media, fact-checking claims, and recognizing the complexity of narratives aligned with biblical calls for integrity. Miriam understood that fighting misinformation was part of seeking justice. The Holy Land story deserved accurate telling, not distorted conspiracies. The oracle noted, while Israel's supporters and critics both push narratives, Christians must walk carefully, guided by truth. Stereotypes hurt real people. Authentic love demands intellectual honesty. The influence of Zionism in politics and media should be examined rationally, acknowledging lobbying, cultural presence, and diaspora solidarity, while rejecting blanket anti-Semitic caricatures. Christians, committed to truth, will differentiate fact from fiction, critique policy instead of demonizing ethnicity or faith. Miriam nodded, grasping the delicate balance. Unraveling these layers, she learned that faith must resist sensationalism and oversimplification. Truth and compassion remained the guides. With the tapestry of history and complexity revealed, Miriam felt her perspective shift. She now understood that modern Israel, though connected by heritage to biblical Israel, was not the identical spiritual entity. It was a modern nation-state with secular governance, fulfilling political goals, not necessarily walking in covenant fidelity. Yet, Miriam recognized that God's plans are mysterious. The land and people of Israel remain significant in the biblical narrative. Even if the modern state does not fully embody covenantal ideals, it could still play a role in divine destiny. Christians must hold this tension, neither dismissing modern Israel as irrelevant nor worshiping it as infallible. The oracle guided her back through key lessons. Biblical Israel was about covenant and obedience. Modern Israel arose from political necessity and historical trauma. The land remains central, but the spiritual conditions have changed. Christians should thus engage humbly, ethically, and prayerfully. Miriam imagined standing before a congregation, explaining these nuances. She would challenge them, support Israel's right to exist and security, stand against anti-Semitism, remember Jewish suffering. Also, encourage moral accountability, recognize Palestinian suffering, and push for reconciliation. Pray that one day the spiritual fervor of ancient Israel might re-emerge. As the oracle's simulation dimmed, Miriam felt gratitude. She had sought truth and found complexity. She realized that honest understanding does not weaken faith, it strengthens it, anchoring it in reality. Now she could partake in dialogues about Israel with compassion, knowledge, and discernment. The oracle whispered, "Your journey ends soon, but the world's story continues. Carry these insights forth. Help others see beyond false dichotomies. In doing so, you honor the very covenant that demanded truth and righteousness from Abraham's descendants and all who join their legacy." The oracle gave Miriam a final test. It presented hypothetical scenarios. What if tomorrow Israel expanded settlements, further marginalizing Palestinians? Would Christians still support it blindly? What if Israel's leadership embraced more inclusive policies? Would that make it closer to biblical ideals? Miriam answered in her heart, Christians must maintain a principle-based approach, stand for justice and mercy, encourage policies that promote peace and human dignity. If modern Israel moves toward covenant ethics, celebrate that progress. If it strays, offer loving critique. This approach is faithful to Scripture's calls for righteousness. The oracle nodded. By applying these principles, you avoid tribalism and partisanship. Instead, you embody the prophetic tradition that held ancient Israel accountable, the teaching of Jesus who transcended ethnic boundaries, and the moral integrity that all believers should uphold. Miriam realized that one does not need a simplistic equation, modern Israel equals biblical Israel, to care deeply about Israel's people and future. One can love and respect Jewish heritage, honor God's enduring relationship with them, and still recognize the differences between ancient covenant and contemporary political state. This balanced posture could bridge divides. It allowed solidarity with Jewish struggles against anti-Semitism, recognition of Israel's need for security, and empathy for Palestinians seeking justice. Instead of fueling contention, it fostered healing and understanding. The oracle's glow brightened. Now you see that wisdom is not found in rigid categories, but in faithful discernment. Carry this wisdom forward, and may it guide your own scholarship, faith, and activism. Miriam felt tears welling in her eyes. She understood now. The truth is often complex, but embracing that complexity was the only path toward genuine faithfulness. In the next phase of the simulation, Miriam observed Christian communities worldwide responding differently to these insights. Some embraced the complexity, adjusting their theology and activism. They began partnering with peacemaking initiatives, supporting dialogue groups between Israelis and Palestinians, funding educational programs that built empathy. Other Christians clung to old narratives, fearing that critical thinking undermined biblical fidelity. They dismissed nuanced arguments as anti-Israel, equating any criticism with disloyalty to God's chosen people. This polarization was a stumbling block to truth and love. The oracle reminded Miriam, growth often requires courage. Recognizing complexity is not betrayal. It's a deeper form of loyalty to God's truth. Those who dare to see beyond black and white categories grow in wisdom and love. Miriam saw how different Christian voices influence policy and public opinion. Some urged political leaders to pursue balanced peace efforts. Churches hosted interfaith dialogues, encouraging Jewish and Palestinian Christian voices to be heard. In these spaces, ancient wounds could slowly heal. Yet obstacles remained. Fear and mistrust do not vanish easily. Historical traumas linger, and extremist ideologies resist compromise. Miriam knew that lasting change would require patience, perseverance, and ongoing reliance on divine guidance. Still, the seed was planted. Christians who understood the nuanced relationship between biblical Israel and modern Israel could become catalysts for more ethical engagement. They could model a faith that prized righteousness over nationalism, compassion over expediency. Miriam marveled at this vision. If more believers walked this path, the Holy Land's future might be brighter. Perhaps not an immediate transformation, but a gradual realignment with the covenantal spirit that once shaped a people's destiny. The oracle now offered Miriam a glimpse of the future, uncertain, but filled with possibilities. She saw leaders emerging who would champion dignity and reconciliation. New generations grew up learning multiple narratives, understanding complexity from a young age. Technology facilitated shared cultural projects, art, music, and environmental cooperation. In these visions, modern Israel remained a political entity, but perhaps one increasingly shaped by ethical considerations. The memory of biblical Israel's covenant inspired some Israelis to strive for a more just society. Palestinians, too, found partners willing to listen, to recognize their humanity and historical ties to the land. Christians played a quiet but essential role. neither dominating nor manipulating, but serving as mediators of grace. By applying biblical discernment, they challenged their communities to transcend simplistic allegiances. They supported local peacemakers, donated to charities aiding both sides, and prayed not just for one group's victory, but for divine wisdom and mercy to prevail. The oracle's voice softened. This is not a guaranteed outcome, only a possibility. Human freedom remains. People can choose bigotry or empathy, stubbornness or growth. But you have seen the strands that could weave a better tapestry. Miriam smiled. Even if the perfect realization of covenantal ideals remained distant, striving toward them mattered. Faithfulness was not about achieving utopia overnight, but about walking steadily toward God's moral horizon. The oracle concluded, modern Israel's identity may never perfectly align with biblical Israel's spiritual essence, but that does not excuse resignation. Christians can still advocate for moral progress, inspired by the ancient covenant's highest ideals. As the simulation's final scenes approached, the oracle returned Miriam to the research facility. The holographic desert faded, replaced by the quiet hum of machinery and the subtle glow of monitors. Miriam rubbed her eyes, heart full of insights. She had journeyed through ages, met patriarchs, prophets, kings, exiles, returned exiles, modern pioneers, and war-torn communities. She had learned that the biblical Israel was a covenant people chosen to reflect divine righteousness. Modern Israel is a nation-state born of political necessity and historical anguish, culturally rich but spiritually diverse, often secular. The two share a name, a land, and a heritage, but not an identical spiritual posture. For Christians, this meant careful discernment. Blessing Israel involves neither demonization nor blind endorsement, but a balanced approach rooted in love, truth, and justice. The future remains unwritten, and prophecy elusive. Yet believers can influence outcomes by upholding moral standards, encouraging empathy, and supporting peace efforts. Miriam thanked the oracle. Her doctoral research would now have depth and nuance. She would write and teach others that understanding modern Israel through a biblical lens is neither straightforward nor impossible. It is a journey that demands humility, compassion, and intellectual honesty. As she left, she carried a sense of responsibility. She would strive to communicate these complexities to her students, colleagues, and fellow believers. Maybe this would spark healthier conversations and more informed prayers. Maybe it would lead some to reconsider their stances, opening doors for healing and understanding. Outside the facility, dusk fell. Miriam gazed at the horizon. The Holy Land lay thousands of miles away, but its lessons now lived in her heart. She stepped forward, determined to share what she had learned. In the final moment, Miriam stood before a camera, recording a message for future scholars and believers. She wanted to convey her findings simply. We must remember that the Israel of the Bible and the Israel of today are related but not identical. The biblical covenant demanded spiritual obedience and moral integrity. Modern Israel, born in a troubled world, focuses on political survival and national identity. Christians should acknowledge the historical significance, celebrate Jewish resilience, and grieve the suffering of all in the region. But we must never conflate political policies with divine sanction. She paused, choosing words carefully. To truly bless Israel is to call it higher, towards justice and peace, to honor its profound history while recognizing its present challenges. God's plans are not thwarted by human complexity, but we are accountable for how we engage. We must pray, learn, and advocate for righteousness in real time, not just cling to nostalgic visions of a past that may never return. Miriam ended her recording with a prayer that Christians grow in wisdom, that Israelis and Palestinians find just peace, and that the spiritual depth of the covenant shine through in unexpected ways. She turned off the camera, knowing her message would ripple outward. Outside, stars dotted the night sky. The journey had ended, but the conversation would continue in lecture halls, churches, synagogues, mosques, think tanks, and living rooms worldwide. Miriam embraced the complexity, grateful that real faith had room for honest questions. Moral courage, in the pursuit of deeper truth. As Miriam's journey ends, ours begins. What's your take? Can modern Israel carry the spiritual weight of its ancient counterpart, or has it become something entirely new? Share your perspective below. Your voice matters in this dialogue. If this story moved you, inspire someone else by sharing it. And before you go, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into the untold stories that shape our world. Let's explore history together.